Folks, welcome to Paisa Vaisa. I'm your host Anupam Gupta, B50 on Twitter, and today we are going to go deep into ESG with one of the biggest indices in the world that tracks this, the S&P 500 ESG Index, and a lot of ESG ETFs are linked to this index. Remember what ETFs are? They are linked to an index, and today we are going to talk about the index itself. My guest today is a returning guest. You heard her last in May 2020, really long time ago, lockdown then, pretty much a lockdown now. At that point of time, we were talking about index investing, and I'm thrilled to have her back today to talk about ESG. Koel Ghosh, welcome to Paisa Vaisa. Thank you so much for doing this for our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be back.
We could have had you in the studio. Maybe we'll do that someday. So, folks, Koel Ghosh is the head South Asia S&P Dow Jones Indices, the makers of some of the biggest indices in the entire world. Koel, so let's start with the history, right? I mean, the history of ESG. For our listeners who are probably new to this, although we've done ESG before in one episode, what exactly are E, S, and G, and why are they important?
Okay, so let's get on with the acronyms. E is environmental, S is social, and G is governance. And these are all best practice principles and factors that investors are now increasingly incorporating in their investment decisions. Now, environmental factors are related to natural world, which includes the reuse of renewable and non-renewable resources. Social factors now become more ones that affect people's lives. So this category will be the management of human resources and local communities. And governance factors, of course, includes inherent to business models. So, common industry practices such as board diversity and structure or tax strategy. Now, there is a growing interest and a movement towards financing a more resilient and sustainable global market and economies and capturing all these risks and opportunities in the global transition. Given there's so much of research on ESG factors, these are now becoming very important drivers in managing of risk and returns. And more investors now all over the world are taking more interest in integrating ESG into their strategies.
It's interesting, right? Because if you look at traditional finance theory and the purpose of a corporation used to be to just maximize value for the shareholders. Do you think this is, this move towards ESG is happening because, I don't know, because one popular belief is that the purpose of a corporation now goes beyond shareholders and into stakeholders. So when you look at E, that's environment. So that could be, I don't know, someone setting up a plant in, say, a tribal community. So that's one thing. How do you think, why have these factors become important globally? I mean, do you think the role of the corporation is changing and that's why this has happened?
No, I think ESG has been something that everybody slowly and steadily have been becoming aware of. You have things like the climate change, you have things like governance issues. All these things are not new to us, and more so globally, the awareness has started creating in the Europe. You'll find a lot of companies who are so conscious that they will not do or invest rather in any company or in an investment strategy that is not ESG compliant. And overall, you'll see that when this consciousness increases in, where the money really rides, I think it forces, organizations, corporations, governments to start looking at these aspects more closely. And I think that's how slowly and steadily ESG is making its way, not only globally, but locally as well.
Makes sense. Great. Now, let's move to the indices part, right? Because as whenever any new factor emerges, it's important to have an index that tracks the performance of that set of companies. So talk to us about the evolution of ESG indices.
So, well, S&P Dow Jones Indices, I come from there, and I will be talking about, where we hail from. We have been a pioneer in ESG investing and in ESG indexing. We started developing ESG indices with the launch of the Dow Jones Sustainability World Index, if most have heard about it, which is the world's first global sustainable benchmark. Now, over the course in 20 years, we have continued to innovate and evolve our different index offerings. ESG indices and ESG investing has evolved over the years from indices that focused on specific themes to indices that target broader markets. Now, We offer a range of index solutions to the market participants within the ESG framework, from carbon efficient ones that help investors measure and reduce their investments' global carbon footprint to thematic indices where ESG is looked at more holistically. Now, let me give you an example, and that will probably clarify this further into how these carbon efficient indices are making their way. You have the S&P GPX Carbon Efficient Series, which was selected by Japan's Government Pension Investment Fund. Now, this is the largest retirement saving administrator in the world, and this served as a benchmark for their investment strategy. Then we collaborated with the Korean Exchange to develop the S&P KRX Carbon Efficient Cap Index, which was their Green New Deal initiative. Now, the more I talk about ESG, the theme, spreads out further. There is clean energy and water. There are strategy indices which have ESG overlays, like you have S&P Equity Target Indices, you have S&P ESG Global Macro Indices. But let me give something more familiar, which probably markets will find it more comfortable to relate to. Is 2 years ago we launched the S&P 500, which of course ESG index. Now S&P 500 is not a new index for anyone, and we know that it represents the US markets at large. And giving it the ESG overlay redefined the mainstream access to ESG and provided global investors with new tools that designed to help them align their objectives with the ESG theme. Now, then we spread that ESG overlay to small cap, mid cap. So you have the small cap 600 having the ESG, you have the mid cap 400 having the ESG overlay. So basically, every index can, once you have your factors and the entire theme set in place, you can keep overlaying the index theme, ESG theme over all the indices that we have.
Lovely. So I want to go deep into the S&P ESG Index, right? Because going just by the name of it, the S&P 500 ESG Index, it looks like a subset of S&P 500 companies that you rank on ESG. So tell us about the composition and the methodology of this index. And I think this started just 2 years ago?
Yes, that's
Lovely.
right.
Tell us about it.
Okay, so at the cost of sounding a little technical, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. So the S&P 500 ESG Index is designed to replicate the risk and the return profile of one of our most popular and large cap benchmark which represents the US markets, which is the S&P 500. Now the S&P 500 ESG target also targets at 75% of the S&P 500's market capitalization, industry by industry. Now, the S&P ESG Index, now the way we kind of, create layers of ESG is, one, it will exclude companies that involved in tobacco production and those who are deriving more than 10% of their revenues from tobacco production or more than 5% of their revenues from thermal coal. Now, this also includes companies involved in any level of controversial weapons. In addition, we also assess companies' performance in relation to UN Global Compact principles. So the companies that show poor performance are low on this UNGC ESG score relative to their industry peers around the world, and so they are also excluded. Now, this S&P 500 ESG index, as well as regional and global ESG indices, utilize the S&P DJI ESG scores, which are governed by the S&P DJI, and they're calculated by SAM, which is a part of S&P Global. Okay. Now, these scores are rooted in the S&P Global Corporate Sustainability Assessment. It's called as the SAM CSA, which is a robust survey, and it's based, its based approach is to evaluate the corporate ESG performance with a focus on financial materiality. Now, along with SAM as a data provider, S&P Dow Jones also uses Trucost, which is now an in-house data provider for all our various ESG indices, including our S&P 500 Carbon Efficient Index. So, you have these various criterias, and if this is too complicated, there is always a lot of details on our website, which literally details step by step as to how we, use the, calculate our ESG indices and what are the factors that are involved. All of what I just said right now.
Very fascinating. So guys, and I'm I'm guessing that at least the composition and methodology of the index is absolutely public. It can be just downloaded from the S&P DJI website, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
How?
Transparency is all about what indices are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Approximately how many companies am I looking at out here? Just a ballpark number, 100, 200?
So it depends. It usually we don't keep a fixed count. It depends on
Obviously.
how the layers, how the exclusions work. So based on the exclusions and based on every revaluation, you will get a set of constituents that will actually qualify to be a part of that index.
Understood. Okay, great. So it's just that, when you've got like the Sensex 30 and the Nifty 50 and the S&P 500. So maybe I thought maybe there's a fixed number out there.
No, so
Okay.
what comes here is the S&P 500 is your base index on which you are using your ESG overlays.
Overlay, correct. Okay, let's compare the two, right? I read the index education white paper, and it made for some very interesting, some really interesting takeaways about how the subset of the S&P 500 ESG index in comparison to the S&P 500, the main index, is probably a more robust or study of. Just tell our listeners about these key findings.
Okay, so the S&P 500 ESG index tracks the S&P 500 very closely. So by design, the S&P 500 ESG index maintains similar levels of risk and return to the benchmark S&P 500.
Correct.
Now, after we apply all the various exclusions, like I said earlier, the methodology targets 75% of the market cap within each industry group in the S&P 500.
Well, that's pretty large.
And then what it does is it selects the best ranked ESG performers by their ESG scores. Now, despite excluding more than 25% of the constituents according to rules-based eligibility and selection criteria, the S&P 500 ESG index achieved a similar return profile to the S&P 500, along with a myriad of sustainability enhancements. What is really interesting is that these real-world benefits represented by the enhanced sustainability profile, gives very benchmark-like returns and enables participants to comfortably align their investments with their values. Now, this doesn't compromise any of their overall investment objectives. Now, what this we are doing is by offering a broad-based sustainability alternative to the S&P 500, the index is beginning to cement its position as a common starting point for ESG investors around the world to focus on US equities. Now, seeing this risk metrics over 1 year, 3 year, 5 year time horizon, the S&P ESG index has indeed delivered on its objective with realized tracking errors consistently around, say, 1% and almost identical volatility. So you are welcoming an outperformance of the benchmark 500 through 2019 and 2020. So probably, while we say past performance is never, how it will be in the future, but you do see that, there is a bit of outperformance over the benchmark, at least for the year 2019 and 20.
Yeah, it's got a long way to go. Let's see how so folks, if this sounds a little bit too jargony and a little bit too technical, I'll just put this in slightly simple terms. Koel, just correct me if I'm wrong about it. So when you choose a factor from an index, you would want to see that if your strategy is actually working, or if you're just left out. Because when you have the S&P 500 and you've got the S&P 500 ESG, the overlay, if the ESG index performs as good as the S&P 500, broadly, it's like saying that your factor is actually working and you're not really losing out much on the volatility. So that's just the way indices work. They take away a lot of subjectivity, apply rules, framework, and then you can see if your strategy actually works. Well, am I right in that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things which I think we should very clarify, and I keep telling this every time, while there are different factors, ESG plays out a little differently. So the aim of an ESG overlay is not to outperform the underlying benchmark. It is to ensure that those ESG factors are ingrained in the index. Now, if those ESG factors are a flavor that results in an outperformance over the benchmark, then well, it's good. But I think one should never look at an ESG index as, this is a better performing index than the underlying index, and that's why I'm going for it. You're going for it because you believe that you want to get into ESG.
Correct. Great. So, folks, on the other side of this break, I'm just taking a break right now. When we come back, we'll make this India specific. We've spoken a lot about how this has worked out globally, how ESG emerged, what the indices are. We're going to talk about the India specific trends now on this episode of Paisa Vaisa. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. My guest, Koel Ghosh, head South Asia, S&P Dow Jones Indices. And welcome back to this episode of Paisa Vaisa. My guest, Koel Ghosh, head South Asia, S&P Dow Jones Indices. On the first part of this episode, we spoke about the concept of ESG, the concept of ESG indices in general, and specifically about the S&P 500 ESG Index, which I think is probably, S&P Dow Jones Indices itself are the makers, the manufacturers of some of the world's biggest indices. So when you have the S&P 500 ESG Index, a lot of ETFs are tracking that performance. Anyway, so that we did a lot of the global part, conceptual part. Let's make this India specific now, Koel. What are the global, if you look at the global ESG trends and where does India fit in, right? Because I've done Paisa Vaisa for about four years now, and ESG has only come up in the last 1 year. I had an episode with Refinitiv, and now we are going in much more depth on the indices part now. So where do you think India fits in compared to the global trends?
So today we are seeing an increased ESG integration into more mainstream and popular benchmarks across regions. We are seeing a lot of interest for indices which are related to the E element. I think that it's happening more globally than locally currently. Countries such as India, I feel, are in the early stage of incorporating ESG related concepts. And I think more tools are required to help investors to make informed decisions. I think tools in terms of even information is required. Now, within the S&P Dow Jones ESG indices and benchmarks, they can help investors distinguish companies that prioritize the needs not only of their shareholders, but also there are many additional stakeholders, including their employees, the communities they operate in, and the environment around them. So I think indices become a good way to understand these factors. My experience has been, when we look at a country like Europe, the region like Europe rather, we developed the S&P Paris Aligned and Climate Transitional Indices. Now that is probably something that India can aspire to create that kind of climate transitional indices. But this has helped investors manage climate related risks and opportunities. If India tomorrow sees that kind of focus on that aspect, creating those indices will not be a problem. We also offer thematic ones, which are, like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of concepts in ESG. There is clean energy, there is water, and these are themes which I think slowly and steadily will start getting incorporated into the entire sustainability theme. Our core, of course, mainstream index is the S&P ESG Index, and I think that's where it has been successful. Like any passive market, you'll see the passive market also grew from acceptance of broader indices into then the factor-led indices. I think in India we are still seeing more of an acceptance in the space of investing for the broader ones rather than specific factor ones. So I think when it comes to markets such as us, we would probably, I think it's an easier concept to use the overlays on broader indices, get that acceptance and understanding from the investors who then are incorporating such ESG factors and learning from that, and then moving on from there.
Very interesting. So I think what you're saying is that we already have the S&P BSE. You have a whole list of S&P BSE indices, right? The Sensex is an S&P and S&P BSE Sensex. You've got the BSE 500, which again is an S&P BSE 500 index. So you're saying that as of now, there's still probably some time to develop an S&P BSE ESG index, right?
No, there is one S&P BSE ESG index which already incorporates these factors. Yeah, exactly. Okay. But like I said, the uptick for such, there's always a lot of interest saying that, oh, we are interested in this index. But then that translating into a product which, comes in the hand of an investors is something that really needs work at. So I think there are some ESG, forays into ESG that we've seen last year. And I think that's the encouragement that I think the market right now needs for more and more players to step into the space.
Very interesting. Who knows? The Nifty ETF is now fairly large because if the largest mutual fund in India is actually a Nifty ETF. So who knows? As interest goes on in the ESG theme, maybe you can actually have a lot of ETFs come up which are tracking the ESG index that you're talking about. Okay, let's get into the meat, right? Does ESG really work in terms of price performance globally and in India? Since you said we've got an S&P, we've got a BSE ESG index also. What works, what does not work when we just look at price performance, because ultimately that's what matters to the investors if they believe in a certain factor, right? Does this actually work? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, like I said, my understanding is that, for countries such as ours and India, it is a little early in the stage of incorporating ESG related concepts. And I think education and tools are required to help investors understand how they can integrate these concepts into their portfolio and thereby make informed decisions. In India, I think we still don't have a long enough performance history to draw those conclusions. But I would definitely try, kind of emphasize here that ESG is gaining traction in key markets and world, even though some countries are more advanced than the others. From our perspective, our role as an independent index provider is to provide a diverse range of choices that are transparent and are rules-based, which then help towards a global transition for more sustainable markets and economies. So that's what we are doing.
Okay. Since you said that it's early days in India, I want to wrap up this episode on the important catalyst for change going forward. Where do you see this going in India? What needs to happen? What changes or anything, just very big picture thinking that could actually bring in ESG as a pretty good factor or, a fairly large factor for investors to consider for investing here. What are the important catalysts?
Okay, so basically the sustainable investment industry has grown significantly in the recent years. And I think there is tremendous potential going forward. There is a huge appetite for sustainable themes in investors' portfolio. And I think there needs to be more research and insights on the materiality of these ESG issues, especially, where there is so much of market volatility and economic uncertainty. And there are so many various factors that today are influencing each investor's portfolio. And of course, along with that, I think it's become eminent that there is a demand for more transparency among companies, how they act, how they behave, also by trends in public opinion towards issues that matter to a society as a whole. So overall, investors are seeking ways to leverage this data and research to gain greater exposure to the ESG best practices and thereby, make informed decisions in their investment strategies and portfolios.
Very interesting, and I would love to do some kind of comparison between how this works in the US when you're talking about catalysts. I mean, it could be regulation, it could be annual reports, it could be anything. Right? India is slightly new. I think we've got the CSR piece in place. Yeah. I honestly don't know where we are in the ESG front as compared to the developed markets like like US and Europe. I mean, we just had a pretty large green energy company in India have an overseas listing out there. I mean, and this is what in billions of dollars. If this was out here, India, we could actually have that as a fairly large component of an ESG index, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening is people are recognizing that ESG is now an important factor that one has to consider. And that is also getting slowly imbibed into an investor's mind frame and portfolio managers' strategies. I think it would be a good, probably, from a futuristic perspective, as the global markets are adapting ESG, probably, as India has moved up the curve in terms of how passive investment has grown, we would probably see, ESG also slowly getting absorbed into standard strategies and portfolios.
Yeah, I mean, the world is all going in one direction. So, okay, folks, I'm going to wrap up with a small, suggestion for the listeners out here. Today, we've spoken about ESG index, the concept of ESG and ESG indices. Now, I get a lot of queries from a lot of listeners, a lot of conversations happening upon index investing, passive investing. So if you guys want to understand concepts of index investing, remember that this entire episode is actually part of that index investing theme. Please go to the S&P Dow Jones Indices website, sign up for a whole horde of the newsletters. All of these are totally free, right? So like I am, so I subscribe to the S&P, the monthly dashboard. It's got some outstanding information out there for you guys. I would really suggest go there, understand how indices are constructed and how they perform. And S&P's got all of this. This is all free, of course, right, Koel?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole lot of research. In fact, since you're talking, people can look up the SPIVA report as well, which compares passive and active.
Yeah, there you go. So SPIVA, guys, is S&P
index versus
indices,
active.
index versus active. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the most quoted reports out there for people who want to compare index versus active, to passive versus active. So go ahead and just read up out there. And if you want to know anything more, we're always out here to help you on that. But that's a wrap on this episode of Paisa Vaisa. My guest, Koel Ghosh, returning guest. Thank you for coming back, Koel. Head South Asia, S&P Dow Jones Indices. Thank you so much, Koel, for doing this for our listeners.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And listeners, if you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to reach out to me, I'm your host, P50 on Twitter. Thank you so much for listening to Paisa Vaisa.